Hi, this is Brian Nielsen, and I'm your host here on Blockchain 360 Podcast. This podcast you're about to listen to was with Scott Stornetta, and Scott was one of the original developers of blockchain way back in 1992. Our conversation went really quite long. Instead of the usual 45 to 50 minutes, it went over 2 hours. So we've decided to split this up into 2 episodes. So in today's episode, you're going to receive the first 45 or 50 minutes of the conversation, and we're going to release the second episode, or the second part of this, in the next few days. We also were very fortunate that we could actually record this on video, and we're working through the process of producing that, and we'll be releasing that on our YouTube channel. So come back, visit us here on iTunes and Google Play and Stitcher and Spotify, and make sure that you can listen to not only this episode, but the second episode, and of course come back to our YouTube channel and see the video of this entire conversation. It was really fantastic. Thank you.
This is the Blockchain 360 podcast. Blockchain 360 is a podcast of interviews and discussions about the current state and direction of blockchain. Thank you for joining us today. If this is your first time listening, then thank you for coming. The Blockchain 360 podcast is produced weekly for your enjoyment, and show notes are found at our website, blockchain360.co. Come back often, and feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter at Blockchain360. All links discussed today are included in the show notes.
Welcome to Blockchain 360. My name is Brian Nielsen, and my guest today is actually one of the founding fathers of blockchain technology. It's Scott Stornetta. He's a notable figure in the science and cryptography. In fact, the first mention of blockchain architecture was mentioned in a publication that Stornetta co-authored, which described a digital hierarchy known as a blockchain that utilizes digital timestamps for ordering transactions. The concept of the blockchain system was eventually utilized by Satoshi Nakamoto when he was developing the Bitcoin blockchain infrastructure. Together with his colleague and friend Stuart Haber, Scott would go on to lay the foundation for the emergence of the 21st century's blockchain technology revolution. Scott is currently the chief scientist at Yugan Partners, which is a blockchain-focused investment firm providing institutional clients with access to emerging blockchain space via commingled and customized portfolio solutions. Scott, welcome to Blockchain 360.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So in the white paper, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, 3 out of the 8 citations were about you and your associate, Stuart Haber. Come your early work contributed mightily to the Bitcoin paper, and you left the original blockchain company, and we're going to come back to that, Surety, in 2007, which was a year before the Bitcoin white paper was published. So approximately at the same time that you and your associate, again, Stuart Haber, published another paper called Secure Names for Bit Strings, it seemed like a perfect storm that you were so instrumental to the technology, and yet suddenly found yourself not bound by employment a year before. So, are you Satoshi Nakamoto?
Well, it's funny. Just because when the Bitcoin paper first came out, I did not see it immediately. And how I found out about the paper was I started getting mail from people I did not know, asking me if I was Satoshi. Both email and physical mail. You don't know me, but, or you don't remember me, but are you Satoshi? And, I always give the same answer, and I'm sure you've heard it.
So this is a practiced answer.
Yeah. And the reason, of course, that people were asking that in part is that, yes, many of the citations in the Bitcoin paper reference what Stuart and I worked on. And secondly, if you Google about me online, you find out without too much effort that I used to live in Japan and that I do speak Japanese at
Fluently.
some reasonable level. A little rusty, but I actually worked through grad school on the side translating Japanese patents just to earn extra income. At any rate, so they put the two together and they say, does that make you Satoshi? And the answer I always give is the same. So let me just be clear. 私はSatoshi Nakamoto ではありません。でも、Satoshi だったらそれを告白すると思いますか? I don't know any way to state it more clearly than that.
Well, since I don't speak Japanese, can you at least translate that for me?
Well, that would ruin the surprise. So we're just going to leave it at that.
Okay. So you've brought up a lot about your background here, saying that some of the people after the paper was published kind of put two and two together. You, your experience, your ability to speak Japanese.
And my admiration and appreciation for Japanese culture, I would just put it that way.
And Satoshi Nakamoto is the most common male name and the most common last name.
Well, Nakamoto is fairly common. Satoshi, okay. You're earning points here.
Tell us a little bit about your background, some of the schooling you've done, and how is it that you ended up going to Japan, and why you went to Japan?
Sure.
And what have you done?
I guess the short answer for me is, for whatever reason, I am the beneficiary of having had the chance to be in some of the nation's great research environments, and often feel like I need to pay back for the opportunity I had. I started out as an undergraduate at MIT, and then ended up transferring to Harvard while still an undergraduate. Just because MIT felt a little more like what the grad school experience is supposed to be, and I wanted a different experience as an undergraduate. Then I took 2 years off serving as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that was in Tokyo and northern Tokyo,
so that's
north of Tokyo.
That's
so that's where the Japanese
I
came from. But I continued to pursue that. I taught immersion Japanese when I returned to the States. And as I mentioned in our previous conversation, I did a fair amount of side work translating Japanese technical documents for clients in the Bay Area while I was going to grad school at Stanford. But just to talk a little bit more, part of the opportunity, in addition to the research environments of the different universities I attended, I also had the particular pleasure of having an office at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, Xerox PARC.
Sure.
Because my dissertation advisor had a joint appointment at Stanford and at Xerox. And again, what a wonderful environment for research that was. Obviously, legendary things come out of there.
Right.
And it was just a terrific experience being there and getting to hear some of the most far-sighted people speak, both on the staff as well as people that were invited in to talk. I just, soaked it all up. And then, again, through the ball bouncing in the right direction, I had the chance to go work at part of the old Bell Labs when I graduated.
Sure.
This was
was called Bell Core then.
This was Bell Communications Research, which is when the long-distance phone company and the Baby Bells were segmented from the old AT&T
that was
umbrella.
1182.
Right. The consent decree.
Yep.
When that happened, Bell Labs got split, and Bell Communications Research was owned by the Baby Bells. And again, just a tremendous experience, because you could walk down the hall and talk to some of the world's leading economists. You could go the other direction and talk to some of the world's leading computer scientists. You could go the other direction, and it just went on and on and on.
Sure.
And I simply, and this is getting a little ahead of the question you were asking, one of the first things that I did when I got there was bump into the crypto group.
Well, before you do that,
yeah,
what took you there? I mean, what was it that your skill set that Belcour said, you know what, we need to have Scott as a part of our team?
Well, actually, my dissertation, even though I was in physics, my dissertation started to edge into computer science and artificial intelligence. And the actual research that interested them was in neural networks.
Interesting.
So I actually have two things that I've done that took 25 years to become useful. But I guess that's a different story for a different day.
Sure.
And, well, simply that, people often say, well, gee, you did this work. Why did it take so long before it started really coming to fruition? And we can talk about that. But I feel the same way about the early work that I and obviously many, many others did in neural networks.
Right.
Because they talk about the AI winter, this long period of time where there seemed so much promise, and then it all kind of died down, and then it's only in the last few years that we've really, since probably convolutional neural networks kicked things off in 2012, that we have reached the modern era.
Was that, though, partly due to the technology had to catch up with the thought process?
I think you're
theory?
very much spot on there, and it really also goes to why such a delay, I think, in what people now call the blockchain as well. So there are two sort of parallel stories there.
So you're now at Belcour. You're surrounded by all these geniuses, and you started to drift over to the crypto side, the cryptography side. So
Sure.
How did that kind of
migrate?
migrate?
I wouldn't describe it as drift, and the reason I want to call you on that point is that part of the beauty of Belcour was that they had a management philosophy called benign neglect, which was you were not assigned a job to do. You were encouraged to think about problems that would matter and work on them. And so there was no drift. In other words, there was go and talk to anybody at this organization about anything that seems interesting, and if you come up with something to work on, do it. So again, there's a whole stream of people that we need to thank for getting to an environment like that and having an environment
Sure.
like that. One of my managers was the first person to authorize funds for research on what became Google, for example. And it was that same sort of far-sighted philosophy that you saw at Belcour. So maybe I've pushed too hard back on the word drift, but it was explore. Okay, you're encouraged to explore. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was one of the things that, and this is almost off topic, and that is does that environment exist in modern day world now?
That is a great question. And
because we had the Xerox PARC, we had Belcour or Bell Labs, and we had these immense concentration of just mental power with just unlimited resources.
essentially,
yeah. And I look around today and I'm like, that's missing.
Yeah, I think you raise a great point, and I think of it as a great point because I've thought about the issue for decades. What makes for a great research environment, and what do we do to recreate that?
Sure.
And that's a longer story, but I think the short answer is no, we really don't have the kind of situation that we had previously. But there's one substitute for it that I think works very well, and that is having an attitude that we still do. And here's what I mean by that. Okay, when I came into Belcour, I don't know if it was, well, it obviously was. It was some combination of being young and being arrogant that I felt like I should award myself a MacArthur Genius Award and just tell myself, no matter what anyone else tells you, you should spend 5 years just working on what you think is important. And it turns out that sometimes just saying that's what you're doing is enough to gain some protection in organizations.
Sure, absolutely.
And so that's the way I tried to think of it. And so I think that's the antidote to the fact that we don't have on a macro scale those kinds of environments, in my opinion.
Right,
anymore.
they seem to be missing completely.
But one way to make it that way is to simply assume that attitude wherever you are.
Right. No, that's great advice.
And, just keep pushing it until you get into trouble and see what you can do.
I'd like to take a moment to thank the Blockchain Academy. The Blockchain Academy is an educational training firm offering blockchain training to the enterprise. The Blockchain Academy offers courses for both management and developers, offering delivery online and in live classrooms. The Blockchain Academy works with enterprise clients to create and deliver innovative training programs globally. They recently announced a new blockchain course targeted towards attorneys. To learn more about the Blockchain Academy, visit them at www.theblockchainacademy.com. So let's return back to Belcour. You're there, you're surrounded by all these geniuses, and so how did you meet Stuart?
Right. So I'd actually met Stuart on one of the initial interviews.
He was an interviewer?
Yeah, he was one of the people that interviewed me when they were recruiting. And again, just by coincidence, it just happened that on the flight out, I'd been reading an issue of Byte magazine,
Sure.
which is an old...
It is.
that dates us all if we recognize that publication. At any rate, the article was on what are known as zero knowledge proofs,
right,
which again have come back into prominence in this blockchain smart contract world. Well, it turns out that Stuart had done his dissertation on zero knowledge proofs.
Oh, how interesting.
And so it was only by virtue of the fact that I happened to have read that article that I even had something to talk to this person that was interviewing me.
Right.
And, we hit it off. And so 6 months later, when I came back, I already knew at least one cryptographer in the organization.
Right.
And the problem of creating immutable records was something that I had started to worry about back in the spring when I was still at Stanford and Park. And it really gnawed on me, the fact that we were going to move to an all-digital world and there'd be no way to tell the difference between a document that had been altered and one that hadn't.
Right. Well, that's the basis of your first paper that you worked with.
And that's really what, that was the itch that we were trying to scratch. So I just went to Stuart and I said, look, I don't know much about cryptography, meaning I don't know anything about cryptography, but I know that this is going to be a big problem. And if we could get an early start on it, then maybe we could come up with a solution before all the smart people realized that it was going to be a problem.
Right.
And came up.
Well, you were in an environment where patents were really the product you were creating, and why not have something that helps?
Papers.
Yep.
Sure.
So, I mean, it just seems logical that you'd sit down and go, okay, this is what we're doing, but we also have this problem. So identifying what the problem is, and then saying like, okay, what is the potential solution?
Right.
So
go ahead.
When you and Stuart then were thinking about this, how is it that you came up with the idea to come together and create this time-stamped digital document?
Right. So, again, Stuart and I started working on this problem, and we worked on it for a few months, me coming sort of up to speed through his tutelage as to what kinds of tools were available to tackle the problem. And we came up with a passable solution, but it's what I would call an engineering solution, meaning it sort of worked, but there was not necessarily any real elegance to it, or sort of aesthetic or intellectual appeal.
Right.
And it was fundamentally because you still had to trust someone in the system. And so I said to Stuart, and I say, that's my recollection. Maybe it was Stuart that said it to me, but whatever.
It was said.
The two of us came up with saying, wouldn't it be great if we could eliminate trust from this system? If you didn't have to have a third party that you had to trust, some central authority that you had to trust. And so we decided to pursue that avenue of the system as a refinement. We got maybe a couple of months down the road working on that.
Wait a second. So for the audience, one of the things that you have to be paying attention to is that prior to you actually coming up with a solution, if a person was actually trying to create some invention, they had to use a book and write all their notes down on both sides and then periodically have it notarized.
Right. They had to go to a third party who affirmed that they'd been writing the book,
right,
and that they'd been writing sequentially in the book, and that none of the pages had been taken out.
Correct. Or they had to send themselves letters that would be postmarked
and then you don't
sealed.
Open the letter.
Correct.
Right.
So you came up, this was the environment, and so you said, this is how we're going to address it, and you came up with this first engineered solution.
Sure, engineering solution, but it sort of digitized the existing processes, and it had some interesting privacy-enhancing aspects to it. But it still didn't address the problem that you had to rely on someone's word. You had to trust
the post
some
office,
third
the notary,
party, some central authority. And I said, let's see if we can't build a trust-free system. So we work on this for a while, and finally, Stuart sort of says, Scott, let's just admit that there's no way to do this. But let's salvage a paper out of it by writing a proof that there's no way to do this.
Uh-huh.
And so we start working on this proof and coming up with some symbolic constructs for what it means to even prove this sort of thing. And it was actually in the midst of proving that you couldn't do it that we stumbled on the solution.
Oh, how interesting.
In fact, for me, for my particular part of the contribution, it's still very vivid in my mind. My wife and I guess two of our children, we were out just waiting in line at a restaurant, and Stuart and I had been having the conversation that day, just waiting for a table. And I said, the problem here is, as soon as two people agree to collude, you need a third person to observe that. And then they're going to reach out to that third person and try to collude with them, which requires the need for a fourth person. And so the only way you could ever solve the problem would be to have a conspiracy that involved everyone in the world. And that was when I realized that that is in fact the solution. Essentially what you're doing in the system...
Oh, it's everyone's a validator.
Everyone is in on it.
Right.
And so
or everyone that wants to be a part of it.
Yeah.
Right.
And so nobody can fake it.
Right.
What you have is this interlinked chain of blocks of records that are widely distributed, and the ability to call fraud is so maximized that no one can get away with it. And that was really how it went down.
So you came out with this first paper, and you
Okay,
came
now I'm going to just tell one other story.
Please do.
Okay? Because I know that we can cut them.
We can cut anything you want.
Because this is a little egotistical, or it maybe sounds a little egotistical, but it's a true story, and so I'm going to tell it, and you can decide what to cut and what not to.
The more egotistical, the more we keep.
Okay. I'd been trained as a physicist, and there was this folk story attributed to Hans Bethe, who was one of the great physicists of the 30s and the whole quantum mechanics era. And he had been working on this problem of the thermonuclear reactions that fundamentally light the stars, make them run. And one day he finally figured out what the key mechanism was, the key thermonuclear reaction.
The trigger point.
And that night he went out on a date, and he and his date are looking up at the stars, and she says something like, "The stars, aren't they beautiful, how they twinkle?" And he goes, "Yes, and I'm the only person in the world that knows how." And I don't know whether that led to a follow-up date or not, but there was this sublime feeling that an important question, for whatever reason, that at least for one night, I was the only person in the world that
had
knew
figured
how.
it out at that moment.
And again, it's always a collaborative thing, but you feel like, you remember vividly your little piece of the thing. And I can just remember how excited I was going into Stuart the next day. And I think we have something, but I got to talk it through and we've got to write it out to see if it's really what I think it is. Because it was instinctual at that point. It wasn't all proven out. Anyway, you can cut that if you want.
No, absolutely.
I just remember having
it might be just a standalone piece.
That beta moment.
So you moved then from the creation of blocks. Did you call them blocks at the time?
Well, again, there were a whole series of progressions and refinements to the system.
Okay.
And the second paper that came out,
which was called Improving the Efficiency and Reliability of Digital Time Stamping.
One of the things it did was create the grouping into blocks with what Ralph Merkel, who was a colleague at Xerox PARC,
on the opposite side of the country,
had invented in a different context for use in proving digital signatures, those so-called Merkle trees.
So when did you think to use Merkle trees in your blocks?
Well, that was actually a contribution that came in from a third colleague, Dave Beyer, who's listed on the second paper.
Yes.
Who's at Barnard College at the time. Again, to me, it's part of the way research works that these ideas emerge in the free flow of discussion and conversation.
Sure.
And so all that you can really say is that the group of people that were working on it, somehow the idea came out amongst them.
Interesting.
It's almost meaningless to say which of the people invented which parts or something, because it's all about posing the questions.
Right.
The answers become easy when you pose the right question.
Correct.
And the questions are the hard part. But so that came out of that.
So you created these items, you created the construct of it, and you've now at least shared with us what was the impetus for developing the articles and the resulting technology. So what was that moment of enlightenment that occurred to you at the time? Was it at that dinner while you were waiting in line, that moment of enlightenment?
That particular aspect of it, which for me was the key thing.
And when you then got back together with Stuart and started to discuss it, was there a moment, that epiphany that just said, wow, we've really got something here? Or was it still, let's think this through, and then it just, all of a sudden you realized it was there?
It was actually more like these nightmare scenarios that you read about with people where they are having a dream and they figure something out and they wake up, in the middle of their dream and they feverishly write it down, and then they get up in the morning and it just is total gibberish.
Right.
What I mean in analogy with that is the idea that came to me at the Friendly's restaurant, it was more instinctual. And so it clearly felt right, but I wasn't sort of convinced that it was right until I woke up the next morning and, sort of tried to read the gibberish.
Right.
If you'll bear
Sure.
the analogy. And so it was when Stuart and I just sat down and started, this is the idea, and it really works. And even then, we had a glitch in the patent process where someone pointed out a key comma that was in the wrong place in our thinking that really changed the whole situation. And that sent us, that led to another couple of frenzied nights where we wanted to make sure, have we missed something? Is this a simple edit just to fix things right, or is the whole edifice destroyed? And so,
And it was a comma.
Yeah, it was a comma.
How interesting.
And where in a formula, not in a sentence.
Okay. So you created this. Now you and Stuart left and co-founded a firm called Surety, which still exists today.
Right.
Okay. And essentially, it was the very first blockchain service company.
I think that's a fair description, although I do want to be clear that it's what I would call a proto-blockchain. And the only reason I say that...
Is that like a proto-star?
Like no, not a bad. Wow, you're on your game today. Because I want to leave room for the fact that different people define blockchain as having more or fewer layers.
Right.
And I'm not trying to step on people's toes of the kinds of innovations that have followed, but from my perspective, and we can talk about that later, why I think it's a useful one. That was really a blockchain company right then and there.
Right. Well, you called it at the time a time-stamped authority, and you had a product that was called Absolute Proof. And basically, as I understand it, you would cryptographically hash documents to prove that they existed. In fact, one of the unique things that was interesting that I learned about this is that since there was no method to create an immutable aspect to it, you would actually create hashes and publish them in the New York Times notices of lost and found weekly.
Sure, we did publish in the Times, and that was another great idea, and my recollection is that it was Stuart's idea. But that, I think, has led some people a little bit astray in thinking that the integrity of the system relied on the New York Times publication.
No, that was just a validation to ensure that there wasn't any corruption of documents that you were...
What you're saying is true, but I think, and as things have rolled out, it has proven crucially true. The fundamental validation was the fact that each of the people that requested the service became holders of part of the record.
Right.
And so it's the fact that the record was widely distributed within that community of people who had an incentive or motivation to hold on to the record.
Right.
That the immutability comes out. Because all you really have is something, in any given instance, you simply have a document that is tamper evident. But when that's widely distributed to a group of people that have no ability, in essence, to collude, then you get an immutable record.
Right, because it's publishing it in the New York Times, the distribution, I think, was 670,000 at the time. For someone to publish and then distribute widely something to
somehow
change that
subvert
would be impossible.
Right, and that really does
not
out.
Impossible, but it would be cost prohibitive.
Right, but you would also not only have to do that, but you'd have to also reach out to the community of users themselves that were making use of the service. And you'd have to somehow obliterate their personal records.
Right.
So it isn't just the tie into the Times. The Times makes it vivid and easy to understand.
Right.
But it's really the community of self-interested users creating a communal effect that is the fundamental integrity of the blockchain. And the reason that I bring that up is that that's what led Satoshi in part to the proof of stake notion.
Proof of work.
I'm sorry, to the proof of work notion,
right.
Obviously. Creating that incentive. But therein, I think, lies a very large problem with that particular
We're going to get to
implementation.
That. Absolutely. So here's the question, though. So what you had been doing at Belcore, what you'd started to do at Surety is you were dealing with the authentication of documents.
Yes.
Why didn't you try to expand it beyond just documents?
Well,
I mean, you have this product that has applicability in so many more things.
Absolutely. And that's really partly answered when you look at the third paper.
Right.
The third paper that came out was about bit strings.
Right.
And that was the paper that for the first time moved beyond the idea of this backbone that simply authenticates private documents into something that comes much closer to being a public ledger.
Right.
Okay? Because we were embedding into what then would become more of a ledger, things that would be publicly available.
Right.
And so we did try to push the envelope. But let me just give you an analogy for situating yourself in the time the technology times we were living in.
Right.
You know, you're still talking about dial-up modems. You're still talking about, hard disk drives that held tens of megabytes.
Well, I remember my first hard drive had 5, and I was thrilled. I
Right.
thought, unlimited space.
Right. I remember, and this is a few years earlier, the first issue of Macworld came out. And on the back of it, it has this ad, okay? And it says, bottomless storage. And the reason they called it bottomless was they were selling 10 and 20 megabyte disk drives.
And that was
meaning you're never going to run out of space.
Right.
And so fast forward to the fact that you've got something like Bitcoin, which has a shared ledger that's larger than 200 gigabytes.
Right, it is.
Okay.
And growing.
Right, and it only grows. Replicated in, thousands, if not tens of thousands of locations. And the fact that that size of a ledger
has to be
in a sense,
replicated
what's
all the
required.
time. I know.
Okay. That was just completely beyond our, ability to think in those terms. We were trying everything we could to make the fundamental backbone record as small as we possibly could.
Right.
It was also at a time where the whole notion of an internet where you could just assume peer-to-peer connectivity with anyone that you wanted to communicate with
Was in its infancy.
in fact, I still remember even when we founded Surety, our first major investor, who himself was a very sophisticated technologist. I told him that we would need to gain peer-to-peer access to his company so that they could use it for real-time timestamp. And he goes, there's no way in the world I'm going to open up a port, on one of my company's servers to anyone that wants to come in. Think of, what a disaster that would be. Well, of course, that's what the internet is.
It's what it is.
And so the mindset, the world that we occupied was so different. It's not unlike, you remember with the Y2K problem.
Right.
It just seems so laughable now because why was there a Y2K problem? Because
we didn't put 19.
we had so little memory to work with and so little storage to work with that it really mattered instead of saying 1956 to just say 56.
Right.
Okay. Well, that was the kind of memory and connectivity and storage world that we were living in.
Right.
And so some of these things, they just don't come out in their full expansiveness until you see exponential decrease in the cost of and exponential increase in the size of or capacity of bandwidth and storage and memory and
technology
processing
is
power.
Absolutely deflationary because you get more for less always.
Right.
And so it's very interesting.
It's deflationary in the producer and consumer
Correct.
world.
That's correct.
It's marvelously expansionary in the inventor's world.
Correct.
Because each successive wave of improvement enables rethinking so much about how the world is going to how people are going to interact.
Correct.
So it's just this gift that keeps on giving of, new vistas, new ways to think about things in an information-rich, bandwidth-rich, computational resource-rich world.
Right. As an example, I'm just going to make this analogy is that so often, especially young learners of all technology, don't realize how computational expansion has actually occurred. Everyone's probably familiar with the cards that open up and play a little music. The computational aspect of those cards exceed what was the computational power that put men on the moon.
Yeah, and that's the right analogy.
Something we throw away, and yet it is so powerful
the
compared to what we
navigational
had.
computers that ran on Apollo is the right benchmark to compare those two.
It's absolutely fascinating. Now, one of the things that you did when you had Surety, of course, is that instead of calling it a blockchain system, which is something that you tried to use before, you called this a hash chain linking. Was that just marketing terminology, trying to figure out a way to do it? I mean, it seems to me that from today's viewpoint, those are almost interchangeable words.
Sure. I mean, as I said before, what we had was a cryptographically linked chain of blocks that were widely distributed. So it doesn't seem like much of a stretch to call it a blockchain. But if that was the only thing we did wrong, Stuart and I, in trying to make a go of this thing, things would be very different. We made all sorts of mistakes. We had no idea what we were doing. And so narrow branding and narrow marketing was just one of a long litany of
who knew
everything
that blockchain was going to be
wrong.
the terminology?
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
Nobody knew.
I do want to be clear, okay? And I say this with all deference to those that have made great contributions forward. We knew we were onto something very big. We knew that whether by luck or intelligence, we had run across something that was, because of its democratizing effect,
right.
because of its decentralizing effect,
right.
Because it removed power from a single authority and distributed it, we knew that there would be societal implications.
Right. Now, coming back to the other considerations or other things that you could do with this technology, a couple of years after you wrote your second paper, in June actually of 1996, the NSA actually published a paper called How to Make a Mint, the Cryptography of Anonymous Electronic Cash. Now, were you aware of that paper at the time?
Well, I was certainly caught up in the zeitgeist because that was not the only paper. And just to pick one person as an example.
I picked these people simply because this is the NSA.
It is the NSA.
I mean,
okay.
And why would they be writing this, first of all?
Oh, well, they give them a little bit of latitude. How do you get smart, creative people to work someplace if part of it doesn't give you a little bit of room to run?
Okay.
But that whole community, and David Chaum is the name that
Sure.
I associate it with because...
Well, actually, he wasn't one of the three authors.
I understand.
Right,
but
right.
what I'm saying is...
At the same time, he was doing his papers too.
There were many of us that were excited about the potential for cryptography to create a new set of trust foundations
Right.
for society in general.
Right.
And again, I was very much inspired by many of the things that he and others wrote. It was a terrific time to start sort of reimagining, re-engineering the social connections of the world.
Right.
So, yeah, that was inspirational, but there were lots of papers, lots of interesting things.
Sure there was.
And I think that actually, and again, perhaps I'm jumping too much, that actually leads to understanding better where Bitcoin was coming from, what it was trying to achieve, and why it was initially successful, not because of all of its technical design decisions, but in some cases in spite of them.
Right. Well, there was a need. I mean, the environment of when that paper came out was as we had just had the collapse of Lehman Brothers. We had Bear Stearns,
Which was one of the early funders of Surety, by the way.
Oh, interesting.
Actually, one of their senior people was one of the early
Sure.
funders of.
So this was it was a financial nightmare at the time, and we didn't know. Looking forward, looking back, we're going, well, of course it's going to work itself out. But at the time, there was a lot of question about the future, and so that was the environment that this came out with. Did you find, though, that the Satoshi paper actually was kind of like late to the game, since there were so many papers before?
That is absolutely the right way to frame this discussion, because it's important to understand that Satoshi comes at the end, if you will, of a long line of efforts
Right.
to create digital cash.
His was published 12 years after the NSA published theirs, which
Right.
David had written a couple before.
Right.
And
And so I think that's really the right context to think about the early success of Bitcoin. Namely, okay, here's a community that has been wandering in the wilderness for a long, long time, hoping for something that would actually stick.
Right.
Okay? And in that sense, I don't mean this as a discredit to Satoshi. In that sense, something that even started to come close was sort of quickly anointed as a solution.
Right.
Whereas if there hadn't been this community looking for so long for something to work, I don't think we would have seen the early uptake that Bitcoin had that was essential for it reaching out to a wider audience.
Sure. You said early on that you were not originally aware of when the paper was published, and it was really afterwards when people were both emailing you and sending you physical letters asking you.
That I actually looked at the paper.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you finally got to that paper, what was your first thoughts? I mean, did you look at it and go, this is, not really much different. Maybe this proof of work concept on consensus is interesting. So what was that initial feeling you got?
Well, I'll give you a couple of reactions. I can first remember reading through the paper and saying, yeah, and then sort of saying, where's the rest? Is this all there is?
Yeah, 9 pages.
Is this?
And the last page is citations.
And there were some great advances in the paper. Okay, and
so what were these surprises?
Well, let me talk about what I thought was the really good stuff.
Okay.
Because, we were all interested in the whole digital cash problem.
Right.
But neither Stuart or I ever thought that what we did would have anything to do with that. And here's why. As originally proposed, these digital cash questions were trying to do two things. One, there was this sense that cash did not carry a trace, a record of who it went from.
Correct.
And yet
it's anonymous.
It carried its own integrity with it.
That's correct.
Okay. And second, by that reason, it did not have a double spend problem. And so anonymity and the double spend were the issues that the community collectively at the time was thinking were what had to be solved in order to create digital cash.
Right.
Okay. And we did not see our work as having applicability to that. Now, let's talk about Bitcoin.
This concludes part 1 of our conversation with Scott Stornetta. Please be sure to come back for part 2.
The Blockchain 360 podcast is produced weekly. Have a question? Want us to interview someone specific? Wish to hear about a particular topic? Let us know. You can email podcast@blockchain360.co or tweet us on Twitter @blockchain360 or at our website blockchain360.co.